Chapter 2 of Best Russian Short Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Best Russian Short Stories, edited and compiled by Thomas Seltzer. The Queen of Spades by Alexander Pushkin. Part 2. 4.
Lizaveta Ivanovna was sitting in her room, still in her ball dress, lost in deep thought. On returning home she had hastily dismissed the chambermaid, who very reluctantly came forward to assist her, saying that she would undress herself, and with a trembling heart had gone up to her own room, expecting to find Hermann there, but yet hoping not to find him. At the first glance she convinced herself that he was not there, and she thanked her fate for having prevented him keeping the appointment. She sat down without undressing, and began to recall to mind all the circumstances which in so short a time had carried her so far. It was not 3 weeks since the time when she first saw the young officer from the window, and yet she was already in correspondence with him, and he had succeeded in inducing her to grant him a nocturnal interview. She knew his name only through his having written it at the bottom of some letters. She had never spoken to him, had never heard his voice, and had never heard him spoken of until that evening. But strange to say, that very evening at the ball, Tomsky, being piqued with the young Princess Pauline N., who, contrary to her usual custom, did not flirt with him, wished to revenge himself by assuming an air of indifference. He therefore engaged Lizaveta Ivanovna, and danced an endless mazurka with her. During the whole time he kept teasing her about her partiality for engineer officers. He assured her that he knew far more than she imagined, and some of his jests were so happily aimed that Lizaveta thought several times that her secret was known to him. "From whom have you learned all this?" she asked, smiling. "From a friend of a person very well known to you," replied Tomsky, "from a very distinguished man." "And who is this distinguished man?" "His name is Hermann." Lizaveta made no reply, but her hands and feet lost all sense of feeling. "This Hermann," continued Tomsky, "is a man of romantic personality. He has the profile of a Napoleon and the soul of a Mephistopheles. I believe that he has at least 3 crimes upon his conscience. How pale you have become!" "I have a headache. But what did this Hermann, or whatever his name is, tell you?" "Hermann is very much dissatisfied with his friend. He says that in his place he would act very differently. I even think that Hermann himself has designs upon you. At least he listens very attentively to all that his friend has to say about you." "And where has he seen me? In church, perhaps, or on the parade?" "God alone knows where. It may have been in your room while you were asleep, for there is nothing that he..." 3 ladies approaching him with the question, "Oubliez-vous regret?" interrupted the conversation, which had become so tantalizingly interesting to Lizaveta. The lady chosen by Tomsky was the Princess Pauline herself. She succeeded in effecting a reconciliation with him during the numerous turns of the dance, after which he conducted her to a chair. On returning to his place, Tomsky thought no more either of Hermann or Lizaveta. She longed to renew the interrupted conversation, but the mazurka came to an end, and shortly afterwards the old Countess took her departure. Tomsky's words were nothing more than the customary small talk of the dance, but they sank deep into the soul of the young dreamer. The portrait sketched by Tomsky coincided with the picture she had formed within her own mind, and thanks to the latest romances, the ordinary countenance of her admirer became invested with attributes capable of alarming her and fascinating her imagination at the same time. She was now sitting with her bare arms crossed, and with her head, still adorned with flowers, sunk upon her uncovered bosom. Suddenly the door opened, and Hermann entered. She shuddered. "Where were you?" she asked in a terrified whisper. "In the old Countess's bedroom," replied Hermann. "I have just left her. The Countess is dead." "My God, what do you say?" "And I am afraid," added Hermann, "that I am the cause of her death." Lizaveta looked at him, and Tomsky's words found an echo in her soul. This man has at least 3 crimes upon his conscience. Hermann sat down by the window near her, and related all that had happened. Lizaveta listened to him in terror. So all these passionate letters, those ardent desires, this bold, obstinate pursuit, all this was not love. Money, that was what his soul yearned for. She could not satisfy his desire and make him happy. The poor girl had been nothing but the blind tool of a robber, of the murderer of her aged benefactress. She wept bitter tears of agonized repentance. Hermann gazed at her in silence. His heart, too, was a prey to violent emotion, but neither the tears of the poor girl, nor the wonderful charm of her beauty, enhanced by her grief, could produce any impression upon his hardened soul. He felt no pricking of conscience at the thought of the dead old woman. One thing only grieved him: the irreparable loss of the secret from which he had expected to obtain great wealth. "You are a monster," said Lizaveta at last. "I did not wish for her death," replied Hermann. "My pistol was not loaded." Both remained silent. The day began to dawn. Lizaveta extinguished her candle. A pale light illumined her room. She wiped her tear-stained eyes and raised them towards Hermann. He was sitting near the window with his arms crossed and a fierce frown upon his forehead. In this attitude he bore a striking resemblance to the portrait of Napoleon. This resemblance struck Lizaveta even. "How shall I get you out of the house?" said she at last. "I thought of conducting you down the secret staircase, but in that case it would be necessary to go through the Countess's bedroom, and I am afraid. Tell me how to find this secret staircase. I'll go alone." Lizaveta arose, took from her drawer a key, handed it to Hermann, and gave him the necessary instructions. Hermann pressed her cold, limp hand, kissed her bowed head, and left the room. He descended the winding staircase, and once more entered the Countess's bedroom. The dead old lady sat as if petrified. Her face expressed profound tranquillity. Hermann stopped before her and gazed long and earnestly at her, as if he wished to convince himself of the terrible reality. At last he entered the cabinet, felt behind the tapestry for the door, and then began to descend the dark staircase, filled with strange emotions. Down this very staircase, thought he, perhaps coming from the very same room, and at this very same hour 60 years ago, there may have glided in an embroidered coat, with his hair dressed, a l'oiseau royal, and pressing to his heart his three-cornered hat, some young gallant who has long been mouldering in the grave, but the heart of his aged mistress had only to-day ceased to beat. At the bottom of this staircase Hermann found a door, which he opened with a key, and then traversed a corridor which conducted him into the street. 5. 3 days after the fatal night, at 9 o'clock in the morning, Hermann repaired to the convent of, where the last honours were to be paid to the mortal remains of the old Countess. Although feeling no remorse, he could not altogether stifle the voice of conscience, which said to him, "You are the murderer of an old woman." In spite of his entertaining very little religious belief, he was exceedingly superstitious, and believing that the dead Countess might exercise an evil influence on his life, he resolved to be present at her obsequies, in order to implore her pardon. The church was full. It was with difficulty that Hermann made his way through the crowd. The coffin was placed upon a rich catafalque beneath a velvet baldachin. The deceased Countess lay within it with her hands crossed upon her breast, with a lace cap upon her head, and dressed in a white satin robe. Above the catafalque stood the members of the household, the servants in black caftans, with armorial ribbons upon their shoulders, and candles in their hands. The relatives, children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren in deep mourning. Nobody wept. Tears would have been une affectation. The Countess was so old that her death could have surprised nobody, and her relatives had long looked upon her as being out of the world. A famous preacher pronounced the funeral sermon. In simple and touching words he described the peaceful passing away of the righteous, who would pass long years in calm preparation for a Christian end. "The angel of death found her," said the orator, "engaged in pious meditation and waiting for the midnight bridegroom." The service concluded amidst profound silence. The relatives went first to take farewell of the corpse. Then followed the numerous guests who had come to render the last homage to her who for so many years had been a participator in their frivolous amusements. After these followed the members of the Countess's household. The last of these was an old woman of the same age as the deceased. 2 young women led her forward by the hand. She had not the strength enough to bow down to the ground. She merely shed a few tears and kissed the cold hand of the mistress. Hermann now resolved to approach the coffin. He knelt down upon the cold stones and remained in that position for some minutes. At last he arose, as pale as the deceased Countess herself. He ascended the steps of the catafalque and bent over the corpse. At that moment it seemed to him that the dead woman darted a mocking look at him and winked with one eye. Hermann started back, took a false step, and fell to the ground. Several persons hurried forward and raised him up. At that same moment Lizaveta Ivanovna was borne fainting into the porch of the church. This episode disturbed for some minutes the solemnity of the gloomy ceremony. Among the congregation arose a deep murmur, and a tall, thin chamberlain, a near relative of the deceased, whispered in the ear of an Englishman who was standing near him that the young officer was a natural son of the Countess, to which the Englishman coldly replied, "Oh." During the whole of that day Hermann was strangely excited. Repairing to an out-of-the-way restaurant to dine, he drank a great deal of wine, contrary to his usual custom, in the hope of deadening his inward agitation. But the wine only served to excite his imagination still more. On returning home he threw himself upon his bed without undressing, and fell into a deep sleep. When he woke up it was already night, and the moon was shining into the room. He looked at his watch. It was 2:45. Sleep had left him. He sat down upon his bed and thought of the funeral of the old Countess. At that moment somebody in the street looked in at his window and immediately passed on again. Hermann paid no attention to this incident. A few moments afterwards he heard the door of his ante-room open. Hermann thought that it was his orderly, drunk as usual, returning from some nocturnal expedition. But presently he heard footsteps that were unknown to him. Somebody was walking softly over the floor in slippers. The door opened, and a woman dressed in white entered the room. Hermann mistook her for his old nurse, and wondered what could bring her there at that hour of the night. But the white